where's this land? Where are they now at the end of Genesis 50? They're in Egypt, right? Joseph's in Egypt. Then the family comes and joins him in Egypt. Why? He's dying, but why do they all join him in Egypt? Why do they leave the land that God sent Abraham to? Famine, yeah. So Joseph has been there in Egypt. He was sold into slavery by his brothers. He became in charge of many things in Egypt. Second to Pharaoh, one of the things he was in charge of was storing up grain and food for the 7 years of famine that would happen. So not only did that take care of the Egyptians, but people from other lands who had not prepared came to Egypt. That's where the food was. So all of his brothers and family settle in Egypt, right? So that's why they're there. And Joseph is saying here at the end of Genesis 50 that we're going to make it back to that promised land that we just left, all right? My bones will be carried from this place in Egypt back to the homeland. So that's anticipating something here in Exodus. Joseph's talking about the Exodus. He doesn't know it, or you don't really know it there from Genesis 50, but he's saying, we're going to go back. I don't know that he knew that it would be when it was, like 400 years later, all right? But that's anticipated. What else do you see here at the end of Genesis 50 that anticipates the story that's going to be told in Exodus? God will come to your aid. Yeah. So in that same, looking at verse, what is that, 25? Yeah, God will come to your aid for this. That's an important point. All right. Kind of talks about the descendants also, right? There's verse 23. He saw the third generation of Ephraim's children. And the children of Manasseh, they all come to Joseph as he is about to die. So we start to see the beginning of a nation here. All right. Now, flip the page back over to Exodus chapter 1 and look at the first, let's say, 7 verses of Exodus and see how they connect with the story told in the book of Genesis. What do we see here? Yeah. It's especially those first 5 verses is just kind of like, okay, getting you up to speed on the previous episode, right? This is the recap. And here are the people who are now, in case you've forgotten, story of Genesis at the end there, here they are in Egypt, all right? The 12 sons of Jacob. Joseph was already there. They joined him in Egypt. Okay, so it's connecting. What else do you see here? He dies. Joseph dies. Okay, so Joseph is dead at this point. Absolutely. Absolutely. That language in verse 7, thank you. The Israelites were exceedingly fruitful. They multiplied greatly. Same language you see in Genesis chapter 1. And also the command after the flood. Be fruitful and multiply. What does that have to do with Abraham and the Israelites? Was there a promise to Abraham along those lines? Yeah. Sand on the seashore. Stars in the sky. That's going to be like the number of your descendants. This was said to a man who had no children and couldn't have children. All right? We'll get back to that in a minute. But be fruitful and multiply, that language from the creation account, and then fulfilling of this covenant. So the creation mandate being fulfilled through Abraham's family, the promise fulfilled. All right? So, continuity of characters here, continuity of the covenant we see in these first 7 verses. Verse 8 says, a new king came to power in Egypt who did not know Joseph. All right? In other words, not that he didn't know Joseph, this is centuries later, but he didn't know anything about who Joseph was. Joseph meant nothing to this new king. All right? A lot of scholars, when they look at this, they want to say, all right, who was this Pharaoh? Because one of the interesting points here, just from a historian's point of view, is that Pharaoh, one of the main characters throughout these early chapters of Exodus, is never named. He's just called Pharaoh. That's his title in Egypt. Or he's called the king of Egypt. All right? But never named. And so, especially modern people, the pre-moderns didn't worry about this so much. But modern people want to know, hey, who is this Pharaoh? All right? And why doesn't he know Joseph? So just very brief historical background here on the history of Egypt. I promise this is going to be short. But Egypt's been around for a long time at this point, okay? Very ancient civilization. And very mysterious as it gets back, the farther back it goes, as you can understand. But let's say around 3000 BC, give or take a few centuries, we have Upper and Lower Egypt uniting, okay? And actually, when I say Lower Egypt, that's North Egypt, lower in elevation. Upper Egypt was Southern Egypt, higher in elevation. They unite under one pharaoh, under one king, what had been at least two different civilizations. And so you've got the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom. All of this takes you down to about 1750 BC. Okay, so already, think how long ago that was. You're to the Middle Kingdom in Egypt and after. All right, what happens in 1750? There is BC. There is an outside invasion of people who had sort of been embedded in Egypt, and they take over. They're called the Hyksos. Some people think that it's when that new dynasty took over that's what's being talked about here. Okay, that's the relevance of this. A new king came, didn't know about Joseph, didn't know about the Israelites, didn't know their history and sort of the friendly relationships they've had with the Egyptians. All right? So it could be that, or it could be when these new kings, the Hyksos, were replaced. Either way, we've got an interlude there between the middle and the new kingdoms when you have new kings, all right? So that may be the reference here in verse 8. All right, if that makes sense and helps, then great. If it doesn't, just forget what I just said, all right? Forget the Egyptian history lesson there. Chris? Yeah. I think that's a good point. Yeah, that could be what's going on here. And the point may also work for the transition after the Hyksos as well, is that you've got power struggles in Egypt, all right? And if you look on in verse 8 and following, what is this new Pharaoh's, this new king's concern, right? As the promise is being fulfilled and they're multiplying, what does he say? They're multiplying too much. Yep. And his concern, he says, is in verse 10. If they become even more numerous and war breaks out, they will join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country. So that's what Chris is talking about there, is that They're going to turn against us, all right? Said by people who are paranoid about folks turning against them because they probably did the same thing, or it's in their recent history, all right? So, instead of befriending these people, these foreigners that are in Egypt, these Israelites, dealing shrewdly with them meant for him, verse 11 and following, putting masters over them to oppress them with hard labor. In other words, forced enslavement. Okay, so they made slaves out of the Israelites. It's not clear exactly how that happened or how gradually that might have happened, but it happened. Yes, Marvin. Yeah. Yeah. So when a country comes in, another people comes in to take over a country in a hostile sort of takeover, the question is, don't they often sort of work to erase that history in many ways so that they can more easily replace it with their own values and institutions and everything? In general, that's true. It's more true for later on, we'll see in the Old Testament, empires that take over another place besides where their, let's say, capital is, an expanding empire like that, where, like the Assyrians, we're not going to live in Israel, but we can put people there, and we want to make sure that they don't revolt against us, okay? In this case, it would be the Hyksos taking over a country they've already probably been in some ways embedded in, and they're going to be in that land. They're taking that land. They're not staying in their own land and taking something far away. They're wanting to stay in there. And so there would be some incentive not to destroy everything, right? To whatever institutions were successful, and there were many in Egypt. I mean, just famously the wealthiest, richest ancient civilization. And the Nile, I mean, there's so many blessings there in that land that they would have wanted to keep and retain and preserve. But yeah, certainly there would be some sort of overturning of things. And one of these was likely just, we don't know who Joseph is, we don't know who the Israelites are, we don't care, we see them as a threat. And so that's the Pharaoh's kind of point of departure there. But it could equally be an Egyptian king here who's saying, we've allowed people like this before. The Hyksos, remember what happened when we let them run free here? They took over for a couple of centuries. We're not letting that happen again. So I think that's really a likely scenario here. And so the new kingdom of Egyptians has come to reign, and they are not going to let the Israelites do to them what the Hyksos did to them. All right. So it's interesting that we don't know the name of the king, but later on in chapter 1, we know the names of the midwives, the Hebrew midwives. Just as a little indication of what the writer thought was important here. We modern historians want to say, oh, who is the name of the king? We want to see what that. We don't care about the midwives. Opposite in the biblical story here. We'll get to their story in a moment. But back to sort of this verses 8 and following, especially verse 11 there. It says these slave masters put the Israelites to work in construction for Pharaoh of these certain cities. All right. Now, it's interesting that Exodus begins with construction by the Israelites and ends with construction. So just thinking about big themes in the book. What is it they're building at the end of the book? The tabernacle. Yeah. So later on, we'll see them as servants of God, building in sort of, I would say, glad obedience, this sanctuary for worship. Here, the book begins by them being in forced labor, slaves of Pharaoh in his construction project. One of the cities there, named in verse 11, is called Ramesses. All right. If this happened in 1300 BC or so, let's say the 13th century BC, then this is a city named after Ramses the First. Which leads to a question about, again, it's a modern question we ask here, not real important apparently to the biblical narrator, but the date of the Exodus. When did this happen? Okay. Because we're starting to get into more, let's say, things we can corroborate with secular history that was told in other accounts in other countries, and we start seeing names in the Bible that we see in other ancient accounts. And so, again, as just sort of modern people, we like to ask, well, when did this happen? All right. Two possibilities here. And I think I had this on the handout from last week, which was also there today. Early date or late date. All right. So the early date would put the Exodus itself, not this story, but it's 40 years later, all right, when Moses is 40, actually 80, when the Exodus itself happens, would put that around 1440 BC, all right? That would be the early date. That is based on a statement in 1 Kings 6, verse 1. If you flip over to 1 Kings 6, 1, this is about Solomon building the temple, which we have even a more precise date for. We know even better when Solomon constructed the temple. In 1 Kings 6:1, it says, in the 480th year after the Israelites came out of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, he began to build the temple of the Lord. So it's dating things here. 4th year of Solomon's reign is the 480th year after the Exodus. All right? So Solomon began to build the temple around 960 years before Christ. Okay? So take 960 BC, add 480 years to that number, and you get from that 1440 BC. All right. Everybody tracking with me? This is early for this much math, I know. So 1440 BC. Seems straightforward enough. Okay, that's the Exodus, 1440 BC. So why do people go for a late date also? The late date would be about 150 years later, which again, if we're doing years before Christ, we subtract as we're adding years. So about 1290 BC would be the late possibility. A couple of reasons for that. One is from this word we see here in verse 11, Ramses. They're building a city called Ramses. That would be named after a pharaoh. Ramses the First was not yet alive in 1440 BC. Okay. So that would suggest something after Ramses the First, right? That would need to be the 13th century BC. Another is just archaeology and sort of the scientific historical evidence that we have available to us. I will say the evidence is ambiguous, as a lot of archaeology actually is. You've got this evidence or this material here, but it also needs to be interpreted. Okay, and that's what archaeologists and other historians do. But the evidence leans toward invasion of Palestine by the Israelites in the 13th century BC. In other words, many sites, so we're just working back, but let's say they leave Egypt and they go into the land of Canaan that's described in Joshua and Judges, all right? Many sites in Palestine, in Canaan, show destruction layers in the 13th century BC, all right? Not so much in the 15th and 14th centuries, but putting this at 1290 makes much more sense with what we see archaeologically. All right. So then you're left with, well, okay, what do you do with 1 Kings 6:1? It says 480 years. All right. So different things you can do with that. Maybe these years are symbolic. Okay. That's a possibility. There's a lot of number symbolism in the Old Testament. And maybe it has reference to generations, a generation of 40 years. Okay. 12 generations. Again, sorry, more math here, but I think 12 times 40 is 480. Okay. So it could be saying 12 generations after. And then later someone interpreted that as, well, generation's 40 years. So 480 years, and they wanted to be more precise about it. 12 also is a symbolic number. So it could be just sort of like the symbolism of fullness, the multiplication of two very highly symbolic numbers here to get you 480, that the time was complete now. They've left the Egypt, they're in the promised land, and finally, after all those years of the traveling tabernacle, the temporary shelter, finally something that symbolizes now and forever, till its destruction, the residence of God in his sanctuary in Jerusalem. All right, so it's kind of like the fullness of time. Maybe that's what the 480 years could be symbolic of. In other words, the number in 1 Kings 6:1, I'm saying, could be a figurative number, and not particularly helpful. If that's the case, not particularly helpful for dating the Exodus. All right. So, all that to say, you can make of it what you want. It doesn't matter to me whether you say this is an early date or a late date. I don't think anything in the Bible it hinges on this. I will say most scholars favor the late date, though. Okay, of around 1290 BC when the actual Exodus happened, which would put these events about 80 years earlier than that. Okay, so around 1370 or so. I will just maybe add to that if you really want to know what historians sometimes say about this, since this story, the Exodus, is not corroborated in any other source that we know of outside of the Bible, the fundamental debate, like if you're just watching something on the History Channel or whatever, which I would say do with caution, but you're watching something on the History Channel, the fundamental debate for some scholars and archaeologists, not so much the date of the Exodus, but whether the Exodus happened at all. Okay, so just realize that that's something that gets discussed out there, whether the Exodus and the conquest after that happened. Because I will say evidence of destruction in those Canaanite towns, not only is the date sort of inconclusive, but whether they were destroyed at all. Just a lot of the evidence is inconclusive on that. All right, enough on the sort of historical, archaeological side of it there, but probably just, I think, at least a matter of interest there about who this Pharaoh was. If this is the late date, by the way, then the Pharaoh of the Exodus we'll see is in chapter 2, a new Pharaoh arises. So not the one who enslaved them, but most likely his son or grandson or something. If it's 1290, then the Pharaoh of the Exodus would be Ramses II, the Great. Very famous, very long-ruling Pharaoh. Right? Well, what this Pharaoh in chapter 1 decides to do to help with the population boom among the Israelites is what? What's his solution? Kill the baby boys. Yeah. Why do you think baby boys? Why kill the baby boys? Yeah. If he's worried about them fighting back, then take away the men. Okay? These are the ones who would be most likely to lead and execute a revolution. All right? So get rid of the boys. All right? And then, of course, they can't reproduce. So it's two for one there. You take care of two things, the revolutionary violence and all of that could become a part of this, take away the leadership of that potential revolt, and then take away the reproduction of Israelites, marry off the girls to Egyptians and mix them in with the Egyptian men, and you'll take care of that issue. The issue, though, with, I will say, of getting rid of the baby boys is that it is counterproductive to the slave labor thing that he had going on, all right? But, Pharaoh is not necessarily portrayed as the sharpest knife in the drawer. You'll see throughout this and the next Pharaoh during the Exodus. So just notice as you look through these verses here the importance of the number of Hebrews. I'm looking at verse 5, verse 7. We've already mentioned that. Verses 9 and 10. Look, he said to the people, the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. We must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous. Verse 12, same thing. Verse 20. All right, so again, all of this is showing that promise of a great nation being fulfilled, right? What did God, so just back up a little bit, what did God promise Abraham? If this is the continuation of kind of tracking the Abrahamic covenant here, let's just back up and review. What did God promise Abraham? I mentioned one of them, so you don't get to say the easy answer. Many descendants. We've talked about that now. What else did he promise him? Okay, father of many nations. Yeah. So I would take that to be just another way of saying lots of descendants, right? Land. He promised Abraham this land. It was a big part of that covenant. And one other thing. There's the nation, the large nation. There's the land, and blessing, and what were you going to say? Yeah. So a way to kind of just tease out what that blessing means. That through your seed, all nations will be blessed. So you will be, and your seed, your offspring will be a blessing to all because of the salvation that will come ultimately through Abraham's seed. All right. So God remembers his covenant with the patriarchs. And his deliverance here is based on that covenant with the patriarchs. We'll see that throughout. After the deliverance, just kind of skip ahead to chapter 15 of Exodus, when they've crossed the Red Sea, and God has sort of shown who he is. Verse 2 of chapter 15. The Lord is my strength and my defense. He has become my salvation. He is my God, and I will praise him. My Father's God, and I will exalt him. So it's naming and saying who this God is. He is the God who fulfilled this promise. The promise to Abraham in Genesis 17, verses 7 and 8 was, I will be their God. And here it's fulfilled in chapter 15. And the words are spoken. This is our God. So I just want to say, even beyond Genesis, this covenant continues to be important. And even beyond the Pentateuch, these first 5 books, the covenant with Abraham will continue to be important. Even into the New Testament, the covenant with Abraham remains foundational. Galatians 3, Paul says, we're all children of God. Heirs of Abraham, sons of God, but sons of Abraham through faith in Christ Jesus. Okay? So that Abrahamic connection is important. How old was Abraham when a son was promised to him? Do you remember? 100 is when the child came. When was the covenant promise? It was before that. He was 75. Yeah. So that, he's promised a son. He's 75. He hasn't had a son yet. Sarah laughs. That's how likely she takes this promise to be. And it doesn't happen. And he waits. And he's looking at his clock, It's like, what? And he even tries, and takes Hagar as a surrogate. Maybe that's what God had in mind. He's going to help the covenant out a little bit, right? And then when he's 100, Isaac is born. So God makes these promises to Abraham, and the fulfillment is not immediate, okay? And even when Abraham died, did he see descendants like sand on the seashore and stars in the sky? No. Okay. It was all still a promise. He saw, I think, grandchildren. So it was just a promise to be fulfilled later on. All right? So the covenant is in danger as it's tracking along here. It's in danger. When Pharaoh says, I'm going to kill all the baby boys of the Israelites, then pretend like you don't know the end of the story and you haven't seen the movie, all right? You should be thinking, man, this covenant is in danger, right? God promised descendants a great nation, and right when they're becoming a great nation, right when they're starting to multiply, the very next verse says, I'm going to kill all of them, all right? Pharaoh, the most powerful man in the world, has enslaved them, and now he's going to kill them. So we should be thinking, this covenant is in danger, all right? What about the land? Let's just track it. What about the land promise? Well, they were in the land. Now they're not. Okay? They're in a foreign land. So, just kind of keeping track and keeping score of the covenant. It's not looking good for them at the opening of Exodus. So, notice that when things seem dismal, when things look bleak, God is working behind the scenes. All right? When babies are being killed, when Pharaoh refuses to release the Hebrews as we move through this story, and then later when they're caught between the greatest army in the world and the sea, it is the covenant that seems fragile in all of this, about to break. But God is in control. So, one thing we could ask from this is just, what promises from God seem impossible in your life? You don't have to answer. It can be a rhetorical question or just a question for your own thinking. But what promises seem impossible? Probably no more impossible than it seemed to the Israelites in the first half of the book of Exodus. So, checking that status of the threefold covenant. The nation, they have become a numerous people, but that's under threat. In fact, because they're numerous, it's under threat. The land, they don't yet have the land again, but they are going to be freed and headed toward it by the end of this book. And then, what about the blessing? They are a blessing to some people, but not as they should or will be eventually, especially in Christ. Okay. Of course, all of these promises are ultimately fulfilled in Christ, but we see that it is an important theme here in Exodus, tracking the status of the covenant. Based on chapter 1 here, how would you describe Pharaoh? We already mentioned a couple things about his character. Is there anything else we would say about what kind of man he was? Cunning. Yeah. Yeah. This ruthless using them and abusing them, ruthless labor and enslavement. He's ruthless. Yeah. Yeah. Good. Yeah. Yeah. When the leader is fearful, right? And on all of these things we could say about the people as well. That trickles down and is a reflection of the people. So he's cruel, he is capricious, I would say, as well. He does not know, verse 8. I mean, it says he did not know Joseph. So there's some ignorance there, willful or not, maybe, hard to tell. But notice that he begins the violence. I want to note that as well, too. There will be times later on in the book of Exodus when we're like, oh boy, the Egyptians really are being treated harshly by God. Yeah. Divine violence in the Old Testament. This may just be something sort of to tuck away in the back of your mind here, because it comes up over and over again in the Old Testament and occasionally in the New Testament. Divine violence is always a response to human violence. We see it in the story of the flood and the ark. It was the human violence that started this. It was the human sin and wrongdoing. Pharaoh, you might say, starts it here and is not stopping it until God steps in to stop it. James. Yeah, so I think that's right. As a corollary of not knowing Joseph, he certainly did not know the God of Joseph and his fathers. So yeah, I think that's correct. In the later Pharaoh, when Moses comes and says, "Let my people go," God said this. He says, "Who's this God? I don't know this God." So he will explicitly, the next Pharaoh will explicitly say those words. Good. Before we conclude here, let's just talk briefly about what the midwives did. What did they do? They saved the baby boys, right? Okay. So this is one of those places where probably Hollywood kind of influences the imagination here. But I think it's Prince of Egypt, where you got the soldiers coming in and forcefully taking babies out to kill them and throw them in the river and whatever. I'm not seeing the soldiers getting involved here. It's almost like it's asking the midwives or the people themselves to do this. In which case, this might have been kind of like some government, decrees that are sort of like mostly ignored by the people. We're not going to do this anyway, all right? So that's a possibility there. So in other words, hard to know how many babies were killed in this actually. But here is an example of two women who refused to do it, okay? I'm not saying what they didn't do isn't heroic. It certainly is. But I'm thinking they might not have been the only ones who refused this order. And it's hard to know how it was enforced and to what degree. But here are two, and they're named. They saved the babies. Yes. Yeah, go ahead, Bob. Mm-hmm. Yes, that's a good question. Were they lying here? What do y'all think? Right. Does that sound plausible that the Hebrew wives give birth a lot faster than others, and so they can't get to them, and then are hiding them away. Jim? Yeah. Yeah. S- Yeah. Sharon? Okay. Yep. Well, this is the question I should have begun class with and not ended it with because, okay, some quick comments here. Yeah, Lee and Gavin. Okay. Okay. And that's maybe why it rang true. Pharaoh's not quite as stupid as he sounds. Yeah, there's a kernel of truth to it. Yeah. Kevin. Yeah. Ah. Yes. I think, well, and there's a lot of analogs to that today as well. Is the more you can remove yourself from it or veil yourself from the killing of babies after or before birth, the easier it is for the society to take, right? When that veil is removed about what's actually happening here, then people get disgusted about it. Oh, yeah. Yeah, I think that's a good point. Okay, this has to be the last comment, Amanda. Yeah. Yeah, and I think like Lee was saying, especially for maybe those involved in hard labor. But that's not my field of expertise on many levels here, so I don't know. Um, but I'll add just at the end here that it seems to me they're lying or intending to deceive, even if there's a kernel of truth to this. And it seems to me that God positively rewards them for it. How much is God mentioned here in chapter 1? Not much, actually. But here's where God steps in and does something, and it's approving their actions, which involved deception. Think about that this week, okay? All right, yeah. So I think this is not for us an endorsement of lying. Don't get that out of this class. Go and do likewise, But if you must, save your lie for not to get yourself out of a hard situation you got yourself into. That's when we're tempted to lie. But saving innocent human life. If there's a place, if there is a justification for lying, I think we could say that might be it. Okay. And I think we have good reason here to say that. We could point to Rahab as well, who is... Yeah. True. And we'll see that in chapter 2, actually. Yep. and is put into the Nile. But yeah, again, it's just like the Greeks and Romans exposed babies to the elements that they didn't want. Okay, it's a removal of my agency from it. I didn't kill them; the elements did. All right, the Nile killed them, or whatever. All right. Thank you for the discussion. Almost got done by 10:15, but we'll go ahead and dismiss.